Welcome to another literary reading from the Alaska Quarterly Review and the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center. You can find recordings of the previous star-studded programs at our website. It's aqreview.org and our YouTube channel. And thank you, as always, to Cody Carver and to the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center, and for that matter, the Rasmussen Foundation for their continued generous support of Alaska's literary and arts community. Today, we're going to hear from two wonderful poets, W. Todd Kaneko and Cecily Parks. I'm Heather Lindy, the Alaska State Writer Laureate, and on behalf of the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, that's the kind of the fundraising arm of AQR, I want to thank you for being here today. Gunishish, as we say here where I am on the banks of the Chilkat River in Haines, or Dayshu, Alaska in Tlingit Ani. While this program is free, AQR, like all literary journals, could use your help. So please consider a donation to support the publication of fine writing, and better yet, even subscribe to AQR. All the details are on our site. And now I'd like to introduce Ronald Spatz. Ron is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review. He's a professor of English at the University of Alaska, a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, a recipient of 2 Alaska Governor's Awards, and also a contribution to Literacy Award from the Alaska Center for the Book. And under Ron's over 40 years of dedicated leadership and vision, AQR has become one of the nation's best literary magazines, and also created some strong connections between here in Alaska and the larger literary community, as we're going to see today. AQR remains influential in supporting new and emerging writers, as well as presenting works that include a rigorous questioning of larger societal issues. Ron?
Thank you, Heather. And welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to hear Cecily and Todd's readings and conversation today. And as Heather mentioned, this event is being recorded and will be available on demand on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Please feel free to watch any of our prior programs and to share them. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to presenting these programs without charge to showcase vibrant, new and emerging voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. Before we begin, I have important acknowledgements. AQR gratefully acknowledges the support of the Anchorage Museum and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, our 501c3 organization that makes these events possible. I also want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement toward decolonization and equity. And with that, we start our program. I send it over to Heather.
Thank you. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's writers. Cecily's going to read first, and then Todd, but I'm just going to go ahead and introduce them at the same time, so we won't be too bumpy in between. So first of all, W. Todd Kaneko is the author of This Is How the Bone Sings. It's from Black Lawrence Press in 2020, and The Dead Wrestler Elegies Championship Edition from New Michigan Press in 2023. He's the co-author with Amber Huey of Poetry, a Writer's Guide and Anthology that was published in 2018, and Slash Slash, which was the winner of the 2020 Diode Editions Chapbook Contest. His poems, essays, and stories have been published widely, from Alaska Quarterly Review and the Los Angeles Review to Best Small Fictions, and are also in many anthologies. Originally from Seattle, he's currently an associate professor in the writing department at Grand Valley State University and lives with his busy family in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Todd's father passed away in 2017, and he says that poetry is the place where he talks to him. Quote, poetry has the power to give us our dead back, even if it's just for a little while, even if it's just illusory. Poetry allows us to resurrect them for just a minute, Todd says, or two, so we can haunt each other properly. Cecily Parks is the author of the poetry collections Field Folly Snow, which was a finalist for the Norma Farber First Book Award, and Oh Nights, a winner of the Kinereth Gensler Prize. She's the editor of The Echoing Green, poems of fields, meadows, and grasses. Her writing about the night in 19th century literature has also been featured on the podcast Nocturne, and is forthcoming in the anthology 2119 Contemporary Poets in the 19th Century Archive. Cecily is writing a memoir about her name and the ancestor she's named after, and she's also working on a third book of poetry, poems from which appear or are forthcoming in such places as the New Yorker, A Public Space, and also was in Best American Poetry in 2022. And she teaches also in the MFA program at Texas State University. Cecily Parks, who has said that her companions are books, and that books, quote, offer us intimacy, mischief, and protection. So, Cecily, take it away.
Heather, thank you so much for that introduction. Ron, thanks for bringing us together. Todd, thank you for joining me. AQR, thanks for taking care of writers for as long as you've been doing it. It's my great pleasure to be part of this reading series. I'll begin reading some poems from my book, Oh Nights, which was published by Alice James Books. And because it's spring where I live in Texas, or it feels like spring, I thought I would read some springtime poems. This poem is called The Forest for the Trees, and it came about because I was thinking about how people kind of throw around the term tree hugger to indicate that someone loves the natural world. But I was more interested at the time in what it might be like to kiss trees. The forest for the trees. I believe it's all this pollen that dizzies me. I chance and rechance upon the stalks of wild asparagus, the crimson rhubarb, the fern splayed into the cow road's muck. Is it my eye or sundown pin-tucking the ravine? I believe my panting leaves wet blossoms on the branches of this one tree. Willing my mouth to press against elm and ironwood, I have inklings of missing, but not of what I miss. Solitude is like this, a distance I walk toward but never into. Strings of spit testify to the bark I've kissed. I was living in New England when I wrote this book, and like so much of my writing, the poems in this book were really inspired by what I was reading, and what I was reading was inspired by where I was living. So I was living in Massachusetts and reading a lot of Henry David Thoreau. And one of my favorite sort of lesser known facts about him is that as much as he loved Walden Pond and the woods, he did accidentally set fire to several hundred acres of woods one day, and sort of writes about it in his journal offhandedly. But it's something scholars are sort of picking up or have picked up on since then as sort of a small blight on his record as someone who really felt like a caretaker or in communion with the natural world. And what he wrote in his journal was, I have set fire to the forest. So I took that for the title of this poem. I have set fire to the forest. I put on a dress to walk in the seeping rain, believing that if the willows are suddenly green, I might have something sudden happen to me. I saunter impatiently. The pond would insure against loneliness, but the rain distresses its surface so much that I can't see myself in it. All of my will-o'-the-wisps drown then. Rain sleeks down the fire-blackened trees. Whose forgiveness are we, the pond, the will-o'-the-wisps, the forest, and I, waiting for? My dress snatches at my armpits like a baby squirrel I might take back to my cabin to nurse and coax into companioning me. No. If I were Thoreau, spring would make me want to destroy something. So I become the crocus ripping through the dirt, the screaming forsythia. Silence my tinder. I scream for a soul with a will that huffs and puffs to fill the bud in me with the syrup and stuffing I need to bloom. Like the pussy willows, I know I'll bloom eventually. And when I do, people will want to touch me. This next poem is called Field Fair. It operates less on like a logic of prose and more on a logic of sound. Field Fair. Field wing, field sky, field fall, field flung, field seed, field sung, field fog, field guess, field god, field ghost, field line, field swerve, field bone, field nerve, field greed, field sprawl, field weight, field wall, field hay, field stem, field drought, field flame, field ash, field awe, field myth, field law, field paw, field tail, field feet, field trail, field pod, field burst, field blades, field thirst, field will, field wood, field hands, field hold, field breath, field pulse. I think I'm going to butcher it now, but I really loved, Heather, in your introduction to Todd's work, the quote from Todd about how poetry lets us maybe speak with ghosts or lets ghosts speak. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that I've always loved the way, as a poet, I can let different voices into my poems and let others speak who are not me or don't feel as close to me. So I gave myself a challenge in one poem. This is the poem I'm about to read. To let others speak, to let the more than human world speak. And of course, it's still coming through me. It's not a perfect ventriloquism by any means. But I was just interested in what other beings, more than human beings, might have to say. Conversation between fox and field. Fox. Light as moths, I leave a trace of arcs across. Field. I give chase until the brambles, woods, or fence. Since I wrote this book, I moved to Texas and had children, and all those things changed my poetry a lot. I found that being in a landscape with new plants and animals, sharing my home with new people, made my mind go to different places often altogether. And a lot of the new book I'm working on features Texas landscapes, but also features a slight change in the way I'm approaching poetry. I think I'm writing longer, more essayistic poems, or maybe poems masquerading as essays. So I'll finish out with this long poem called The Seeds. And I think the only reference is to the Odyssey, and Odysseus and Penelope, and maybe the different kinds of hope that the two of them had during their long separation. This poem was initially called Hope, but an editor said to me, "You use hope throughout the poem, you can't call it hope." So it's now called The Seeds. The seeds. The mouth closes around a word full of O. Hope, a plea, a sigh, a piece of enclosed land, a small bounded valley. Also an inlet, a small bay, a haven in the lake I steer my boat into, dropping my good shoes and then my feet into the biting water, because the water reminds me of a dance floor. Oh, I'm 34 again, in summer, giddied by grease smoke and soft serve from the fast food shacks, my blown back hair mimicking the bankside cattails each time I do a double take at the drive-in marquee. Each time I ride a car around the lake, it's an odyssey. Did I hope like Odysseus or like Penelope? I no longer remember the steps the stranger and I danced at the party by the water, expecting what we desired. Sweat darkened my dove gray dress. Nasturtium petals toppled through the salad leaves. Wavelets from a storm far offshore met the black breakwater and surged upward. Like the particular hop in the stomach when I see pews with sky blue cushions stacked in the back of a pickup truck on the highway, or when we pushed our beds together in the damp rented room. The lake had already rolled in our sheets. Mildew marbled the walls with fungal mist. I hoped the storm would stay offshore. I hoped a storm would come in. There's a hope chest at the foot of the bed that a girl should pack, with a heart-shaped stone, a nightgown, and a clump of forget-me-nots she finds by the stream. Not me. I packed a jar of lake water and my grandmother's 2 sets of silver, whose tarnishes clouded the spoons darker, reminding me to be diligent, for no woman has swallowed a storm. Along with faith and love, hope is personified as one of the 3 heavenly female graces. I'm going to quote from 3 writers here. Emily Dickinson, hope is a thing with feathers. Gertrude Stein, I hope, and I hope. I hope that I hope, and I hope. Dorothy Wordsworth, I lingered out of doors in hope of hearing my brother's tread. Is hope the province of women? As I hope to show, a means of arguing gently in a scholarly essay. The blind peer reviewer chastised me for using it, correctly assuming my gender. The water rings on my wooden desk marked pools of thought that I dared to rain. Delete, delete. I erased hope in order to argue, I presumed, like a man, offering an analysis as the only route to the palace. I hope all will be well, Ophelia says, but we know she is doomed when she starts talking about fennel, columbines, violets, and rue. Not a hope in hell, hope against hope, hope for the best. Ophelia reminds me of the mountain laurel, the botanical illustrator placed in a bathtub full of water to paint branch and bloom undistorted by gravity, lifelike even as they died. I've heard of a horticulturalist who entered a field thinking that whatever he needed, he would find, a method I find irresistible until I suspect it is only available to men. The difference between hope and entitlement is the difference between imagining how much hay the meadow will bear and assuming your winter ponies won't starve. Gertrude Stein again. Hope in gates, hope in spoons, hope in doors, hope in tables, no hope in daintiness and determination, hope in dates. Historical hope. On the internet, you can find a poster of the man who became president. Red and blue, the word in all caps, like a vine twisting up the stake of history, a long time ago. Meanwhile, I circumnavigated a minor lake in a car. I was 34 when I put down the Ziploc of candy I'd been surviving on and admitted that I was a woman. I stopped hoping to be a flower girl in a wedding, wearing a daisy crown and scattering petals from a demolished rose. Flower girls first appeared in weddings in ancient Rome, carrying bundles of wheat. Hope in the body, fertility in the field. I can say that I hoped to be the symbol of fertility, hoped to promise the betrothed a green, everlasting earth as they stepped into history. But I never knew who the bride and groom would be. I think what I really hoped for is what I miss hoping for, to be a wild queen, married to the flowers and sailing through a field where fishes swim in the dew. I was a child until I was 34 and met the love I'd hoped for. If I hadn't hoped to be a wild queen, I may not have hoped for a field, a small bounded valley for my dream daughters to drift into like two seeds. How long until winter? Will the shaggy ponies starve? My real daughters ask me now. Their questions are the same as mine in that they have no answers, though the lessons of damage are everywhere. As in the parable of the Texas mountain laurel, whose bright red seeds I unwrapped one afternoon from a seed pod to place in my daughter's hands. The girls were young and tried by resting the seeds on branches to put them back in the tree. That it was too late to undo what I'd done to the tree wasn't what I'd hoped to show, though it was a better lesson, reminding me that only Penelope can undo the weaving on the burial shroud. I hoped like Penelope until I became a mother. Now I think of hope as a swing chained to a branch, It can be used until the branch sweeps the ground with a shush, shush, because it cannot bear so much weight and still loft through the dream-trafficked air. I don't care what you say. A swing may be a child's thing, but the chains that bind it to the tree are not. Thanks very much. I'll hand it off to Todd.
Cattle mutilation. In one version of the song, I was born with a cow's head. We all were waiting for America to disappear us from the prairie, tired of scattering into milk and sirloin across the grass. In the other version, I'm human, knee-deep in the carrion, fur and gristle over the nation's bones. I watch people with blood on their chins. They say, God bless America. They say the animals die and the animals spring back to life. That's a poem from my book, This Is How the Bone Sings. And this book is largely about my family's incarceration at Minidoka, a concentration camp for Japanese Americans during World War II. And so I'm going to read from that book this today, and I'll also read a few poems at the end from the Dead Wrestler Elegies, the championship edition. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But I want to really quick say thanks to Ron for inviting me to be a part of this reading, and to Heather for being the host, and Cody for engineering and making us all presentable, and everyone at AQR. It's so awesome to have been in that magazine. It's such a great place. I'm so happy to have poems there. And how cool is it? I get to hear poems tonight, and those awesome poems by Cecily Parks. So thank you, Cecily, for being here too. I'm gonna read this poem that explains a little bit about Minidoka. When Minidoka is the name of the camp, and when the word comes up often in my poems, and often people would say, "What is that?" So I wrote a poem that explains it. This is called "Minidoka Was a Concentration Camp in Idaho." I'm afraid that all my ancestors have gathered my words like birds collect hair from the dead for nesting, an abundance of silence, whole spools of it ready to tether me to the trees. I'm a new father, too young for ghost stories, too fresh to remember what it was like to shiver out on the prairie. I see my own breath sometimes when my son cries at night. He doesn't have to describe those things he fears in the dark, because my grandmother told me the world will never be safe for us when she refused to say the name of that place we come from. Minidoka, I say to him, and my ancestors laid fingers across my lips. Do not be ashamed, because we are alive, because the birds will one day pluck us clean. Two poems in this book appeared in AQR, so I want to read those two poems. The first is called They Say This Is How the Ghosts Feel. They say this is how the ghosts feel. 1. Minidoka. I never say your name aloud, except when measuring my family's ghosts against the razor wire still wrapped around all our tongues. 2. Minidoka. I cannot contain your name in my mouth. When I speak it, each syllable is a storm of crows, feathers, bone, appetite. 3. There is a flock of dark birds that circle my house when I sleep. Their jagged song, more death camp than dreamscape, more car crash than moonrise. 4. In the dark, my father tries to explain what Minidoka means. I can almost read his lips as he releases his lonely howl. 5. I say your name, but it doesn't mean anything to people whose families were not left wrecked out on the prairie. So I call you America and let that name sit on my tongue like dust. 6. Sometimes things aren't as terrifying when they're so far away. I say your name, America. I say your name, America. I say your name and wait for you to appear in my yard. Shotgun, noose, barbed wire. 7. In the dark, my grandfather patrols up and down city streets, shaking every door to make sure it's secure. He says, America, and then we're all locked out. 8. America. Sometimes I don't understand what your name means. 4 syllables for home, for not home, for bombs bursting in air, for believing we are all bombs. 9. In my dream, my son is learning to talk, but all he says is Minidoka. He's learning to walk, but he just walks in circles. This poem, Homeland, I think I wrote it shortly after my father passed in 2017. It goes a little like this. Homeland. Tonight, my father dreams of the land we all dream of, standing like cattle on dark plains, hooves planted in the mud, horns gashing the sky every time we turn our heads to look at one another. He's dead, not a hermit crab laying claim to the shore, not a deer dashing in and out of shadows as winter looms hungry over the woods, not a man with his family still bound to that town made of antlers and rickety bones. While my father sleeps, the cattle stampede free of the barbed wire. This morning, my son ate an orange, segment by segment, his face smeared with pulp and juice, the peel in shreds across the kitchen floor. He's alive, unaware of all the spirits envious of his teeth, the animals shivering outside. My father swims away from us, back to the island where he could put the ocean between us, whole families of ghosts in the tide. When I was a kid, my mom used to sing me this song, and I remember her singing me "Summertime" as a lullaby. It's a song, it was sung, I think, by Ella Fitzgerald and Porgy and Bess. So it's always been a song that's been really important to me. And then I remember back in the 90s, that band Sublime covers "Summertime." It's a totally different song. I'm like, whoa, what is this song? No, Sublime, you can't have this song. So here's a poem written for my son. One of the things as I was writing these poems about Minidoka is I discovered what I know about Minidoka largely comes from, well, at least as a kid, it largely came from reading my dad's poems. And so I guess, a lot of these poems I'm writing for my kids so that, one day they'll look back and say, well, here, this is something that part of our family history. So here's a poem for my son. And also I'm taking that song back from Sublime. This is called "Fish Are Jumping," which is a line from that song, right? Fish are jumping and the cotton is high. Fish are jumping. The fish in the river are all beautiful fish. Obsidian scaled trout, koi with the evil eye, salmon with shiny tongues. I'm not singing about fish, but about your ancestors who once lived in the land of the dead. Call the trout grandfather, and he will carry you downstream on his back. Call the koi grandmother, so she will use her magic to protect you in the overcrowded waters. And call the salmon uncle and auntie. They will swallow you in pieces to keep you safe. There's a place on the river where the fish jump straight into the fishermen's nests because there is no river, just fish squirming together, a vault of fins and scales in the dirt. Go to sleep now. And one of these mornings, you will ask me how high a fish can jump out of the water. I'll say there are no fish. I'll say there's no such thing as jumping. So the last poem I'm going to read from this book, it's called "This Is How the Bone Sings," and there are various songs. There are some love songs in the book, and various kinds of songs. But the one song that was missing that I think kind of rounds the book out is the national anthem, because in great part, if I'm writing about Minidoka, I'm writing about America and in all its forms. Here's the last poem in the book. It's not really a spoiler. It's just the last poem. It's called "Rocket's Red Glare." My favorite thing is space. Stars shivering as the darkness gathers in silent plumes over our heads. And tonight, my father ignites the sky to let us know where we are all headed one day. We live together on the ground, whether or not we like it, when the landscape is littered with dead birds, with beautiful carcasses that can't recall how it feels to be close to heaven. Tonight, there are other things in the sky, and a poem is a thing I make in the dark as my son plays at slipping, while he dreams of jumping on the moon so far from where we live in America. Once we lived in a concentration camp in Idaho, a distant memory when it was a fire in my father's chest, more distant now that it burns in mine. Once we sang like wolves out in the snow, faces turned up at the constellations and hoping someone out there understands and howls back. And God, that great silence reverberates through all of us. Tonight, my father sings no longer, but where there's fire, there is fire. The heat is my father's, the smoke is mine. And when my son looks up at the sky, he will notice how small everything looks from far away. A bomb is a flicker of light, then a flurry of dust, then darkness. So I'm going to make a transition here. This is my first book was The Dead Wrestler Elegies, a different edition. And this edition, the championship edition, came out just this last January. So I feel really grateful to have this book back in circulation. It's a new edition with some new poems in it and some new illustrations in it, all by me. So what I thought I'd do is I'm just going to close with two poems from this book, from the new sections. Two poems from the Dead Wrestler Elegies. The first one is, so the trope of this book is that the speaker's father has recently passed, and he ends up with this trove of videotapes of old wrestling matches. And as he's watching these old wrestling matches, he's seeing these old wrestlers who are dead, and he's reckoning with his sort of his relationship with his father. And the work is fictional, so like it's interesting. Cecily was talking about how she's interested in how poems happen in other voices, and this was a weird thing where I was writing these poems about wrestling and pro wrestling, and at one point, the speaker's father dies in one of the poems, and I was like, wait, that's not real, because at that point my dad was still alive, and at that point I realized that the poems were doing something different, something I wasn't sure about. And so that was actually really freeing to discover that the speaker in these poems was not me. And once I had that, man, these poems, the story just started coming out. So this first poem is an elegy for a wrestler, the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, who wrestled in the 70s and the 80s. In a famous promo they call the Hard Times promo. They call it the Hard Times promo because in it he talks about hard times. He says hard times are when the textile workers around the country are out of work. They got 4 or 5 kids and they can't pay their wages. They can't buy their food. Hard times are when the auto workers are out of work and they tell them to go home. And hard times are when a man has worked at a job 30 years, and they give him a watch, kick him in the butt and say, hey, a computer took your place, daddy. That's hard times. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is how like pro wrestlers use this violent language, and there's a real beauty in that language sometimes. So sometimes I'm co-opting it. So in this poem has an epigraph also from that same promo. Dusty Rhodes says, there were 2 bad people. One was John Wayne and he's dead, brother. And the other's right here. This poem is hard times for the American dream. Hard times are when a man makes a living at not making a living in America. Hard times are when a man's body finds itself out of work, so it stops working. Hard times are when a man makes a lightning bolt with his heart, electricity pulsing through all our bodies after he's been planted in the ground. Hard times are when the electricity lingers in the air long after the shock is worn off. My father spent most of his life working, so much of his life dying, his whole death trying to work again. He said there are 2 kinds of men in this life. One wears a 6-gun on his hip, and the other whips out a blindfold and tells him where to shoot. He said this before he died, and now that's all he says. Hard times are for how for every good man working a 40-hour week job, there's another man working that same job for more money. Hard times are how for every good man, there's a bad man who's done his best to be good. My father said, there are no good or bad men, only ghosts who haven't yet escaped their flesh. He said there are no things as ghosts, only men who step outside at night and wonder what it's like to walk on the moon. Hard times are knowing someone planted a flag on the moon, a beacon in the sky for those who don't believe in God. Hard times are when the night sky is overcast, and when you look for God, all you see are the streetlights reflected back at you. My father carried his heart in his lunchbox, my mother's name where his ribs came together, a cathedral over his softest place. My father taught me about America, where a man can pull himself up by his bootstraps and achieve anything he wants. My father taught me about America, where there are no actual bootstraps, just boots pressing down on the back of a man's neck, on the back of a man's family. Hard times are when a man discovers the majestic peaks on the horizon are just a cardboard cutout of a mountain. Hard times when a man discovers the lighthouse on that distant shore is just a sad kid playing with the flashlight. Hard times are the shipwrecks, the drowned crewmen, the sailors at the oars, all the debris a man mistakes for the treasures scattered on the ocean floor. Hard times are when a man mistakes his body for debris, his life for a shipwreck, his family for the jagged rocks. My father died by himself, but he still visits me every morning. He says hard times are when a man discovers he isn't living anymore. He says hard times are when a man wants to have faith in something other than the body that has failed him, but there's a funeral bell ringing in his ear. He says he's still haunted by the shadow of the woman who left him. The last time he saw her in the driveway, she straddled his motorcycle and rode it off into the night. The last time he saw her in the harbor, she held a torch in one hand, a stone tablet in the other, and she refused to look at him. Hard times are when your father's ghost talks to you and he doesn't make sense. Hard times are when your father's ghost talks to you and you haven't yet figured out that you can hear him. Here's one last poem. Again, thanks to Ron and AQR and Heather and Cody, and especially thanks to Cecily Parks and her poems. Thank you to you all for watching, for your time, and for your attention to poetry and pro wrestling. This poem is for the pro wrestler, Roddy Piper. He was my favorite wrestler as a kid. The wrestler that really got me started watching pro wrestling. He died in 2015 from cardiac arrest in his sleep. There's a really famous segment called Piper's Pit where he interviews a wrestler and he doesn't let him answer. And then right when the guy's about to talk, Piper just starts hitting him and beats him up. And he looks at the camera and he says, just when they think they got the answers, I changed the questions. So this poem is called Questions for Roddy Piper. And this poem is actually for my dad, my real dad. If a man falls and no one is around, does he make a sound like a car crash in the distance, or like summer's last wheeze, the final gasp of bagpipes on the green? Have you seen the light go out of a man's eyes just before he's hit by a fist or a hammer or a coconut? You can wrap a chain around a man's neck, collar him to a 40-hour week and a 30-minute commute each way, along with the poor saps who don't have a name for what they do besides work. But what is there a man can't do when there's no one around to fight, when there's no one around to leave looking like bruised fruit, no one to wonder what it means to be a man like my father, spoiling for a fight while the rest of the world is asleep? When the darkness lifts, the lights will shine on him so bright. Can you see the shape his body leaves on the ground? Do you recognize the shape of his absence? Can you imagine how dark the world is without him? Thank you.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you, Cecily, and thank goodness we have some time to just hear from both of you. And I especially want to thank you for your generosity of spirit, sharing so much through your poems, but also the little bits around it that we heard from too. It's really generous and thoughtful and kind, really, to let us into your worlds. I guess what I was thinking of, don't worry, I'm not going to be like Piper's Pit. I'm not going to switch the questions on you. I'm wondering about this idea that Cecily brought up and then Todd continued, and it just fascinates me. My other sort of thing that I do is I write obituaries. So I'm very interested in how we both talk about the dead or remember or communicate. And I know Naomi Nye, Shahid Nye, who's been in this series before, she has said that that we shouldn't use the term that the dead have passed away, because the dead actually never leave; they stick around. And I know that's true for me, and I'm just wondering how you find a way of communicating through poetry, and if that's a satisfying way to look at maybe the lines between here and there, or where we are and wherever our friends and family who are gone may be. And maybe and you guys could just go ahead and talk about that, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
I mean, I guess I can go first. I'll just start by saying that Naomi Shihab Nye is one of my favorite poets, and she's one of those poets who, like, I read her poems and I'm like, on the one hand, I'm like, I want to go write a poem right now, and then on the other hand, I'm like, there's no way I can write a poem right now, But I think that for me, my dad appears in my poems after he passed. I remember when he died, I flew out to Seattle just to say goodbye, to his body. and I was there in the morgue. I read here. I was like, Dad, here's some poems I wrote for you that you never saw because I didn't think they're ready. And so like I read him these poems, and as I was reading, I could hear him in my head, like he's like, I'm reading this poem. He's like, that image is extra, and I'm like, and like I keep on reading, and he's like, yeah, you don't need that line either. That line's just it's hollow, right? I'm like, Dad, come on, man. I'm just trying to give you some poems, right? And so since then, like he's in my head, and sometimes when I'm writing a poem, it's not about him, and then he just shows up. And yeah, like I think Cecily was saying, right? Yeah, it's me. Like I'm not saying that the dead, I'm not channeling the dead, right? The poem is me, but somehow the poem allows me to find my father's voice. And I think if the poem is working, the voice is not in my control, right? Sort of like I write something down. I'm like, well, is that a mistake? Is that something I wrote I don't mean? Possibly, but maybe this is the voice, right? That is my father's voice. That is me. That is the poem speaking. And then as a poet, right, as a writer, I get that. And that's a gift, right? The poem gives that to me. And then I get to write back to it. I get to channel it. So I'm not channeling the dead, but I'm definitely channeling the poem. And so when I say like the poetry gives me a chance to talk to the dead, I mean, that's what I'm talking about. It's this sort of, I get to have my dad back for a while. It's not him, right? But it's the dad that I'm carrying with me, right? If the dead don't pass and we just carry them around, and I think we do, right? It's called grief. That's what it allows me to be in touch with that.
Cecily, do you have thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I can add much, except that I think so much of the work of poetry is inviting others to feel a feeling, to sort of maybe the experience is not one, an experience I'm writing about might not match an experience that my reader has had. But I think appealing to feelings is some of poetry's like greatest and most far-reaching work. And I think like that feeling of thinking about grieving or being in touch, however you want to think of that, with someone who's passed on is something that poetry, I think, does such a wonderful job of sharing. And so, however close you think, your poems might be to those who are no longer living, I think it's that feeling of like the feeling of them is something that poetry allows us to really consent to feel, and really like sort of gives us permission to feel most fully sometimes. And so much of the work of poetry is like, so filled with longing and so like sort of writing towards people and places and things that we as poets know won't answer back. So silence, like as poets, we're no stranger to silence. I think we're almost more comfortable in that space of like not having a direct answer to what we write down. So maybe that makes us as poets like most uniquely suited, I think, to talk to those voices that don't maybe respond in the most audible or direct way.
There's a
I'm sorry.
I'd say there's a writing theorist, Peter Elbow, right? He's a comp theorist. He talks about how, when a writer free writes, and I think it translates into any kind of sort of creative writing too. He said when a writer sits down, he creates a text, and the text is not just a text; it's a surrogate mind. So there's a mind that you create that mirrors the mind of your own, right? And so writing is a conversation that you have with yourself. And I think that when we're channeling these voices, or even when we're not channeling the voices, even when we're writing a poem, we're having a conversation with ourselves, right, on the page. And some days that conversation is me, right? Some days that conversation is with someone else. Some days that conversation is with my ancestors, my dead father, right? So that's kind of how I look at it, sort of as a logistically, I guess. The poem is very much this sort of mirror of my own consciousness.
But
My own mind.
here's what I wonder about poets, and maybe since we have two brilliant ones here, you can help us with this. But how much courage does it take to essentially have this conversation that is often very intimate and personal, and even if it's not really you, it's another voice, it's still the things you're sharing, the feelings, as Cecily puts it, are really very much on the edge of things that are important. And what I'm wondering is how much courage it takes to have that conversation that's so private and make it public by putting it on a piece of paper and in a book, or then even reading it at something like this, or anywhere, to students or to your family members.
I think something that I tell my students when I'm teaching a workshop is not to turn in poems that feel so close to who you are that talking about them will feel like someone picking apart your life choices, or what is like fundamentally meaningful to you about yourself. And I think as poets, or I'll just speak for myself, I think what I do write about, I hope, has the feeling of authenticity and coming directly from me. But I also make sure that there is a performative aspect to it, so that the I, the capital letter I, first person pronoun, is the on the page version of me, and not Cecily Parks laying bare her deepest, darkest secrets, or her most vulnerable moments that she might not be ready to share with anyone on the page. So there is this sort of titration process, I'd say, that happens for me. It doesn't mean that I sometimes don't read work and find myself like having to take a deep breath, because those feelings on the edge, I think, as you said, are there. The feeling is all me. And the beliefs and the questions are mine. But the I on the page is a performance, I think, that allows me to address some of these questions and beliefs that are hard sometimes to think about, and that I'm still working out for myself.
Cecily, thank you so much for that, because that word performative was in my head too. And I was like, how do I say this without feeling like I'm giving up some poetry secret, right? Like
it's like the wrestlers, isn't it, a little bit? The pro
it's exactly,
yeah.
Exactly. Like Dean Young says something like the poem is artifice, but the blood is real. Right. And sometimes someone will take a look at a poem and they'll be like, oh, this poem is so honest. Oh, right. Oh, this poem is so authentic or so true. But like, how do you know? You don't know what's honest or true when you look at a poem, right? You know that because the poet has successfully performed honesty, right? And that honesty might be true, right? I miss my dad every single day. I think about him every day, right? He died in 2017. Think about him every day. I love my kids too. Think about them every day. Well, partly because I have to, because they're noisy and right in my face. But like when I write poems about them, right? Everything is true, but I'm performing it, right? The poet performs it for the reader. So, because if the poet doesn't perform it for the reader's not going to get it, right? So the poet performs it to give it to the reader. And that's, I think, when we see something that we say, oh, that makes me feel a certain way, it's not necessarily because the poem is honest. The poem might be honest, but the poet, I think, has successfully performed that emotion on the page for the reader, right? In a way that the reader can take it in. And so, right, what's an honest performance by an actor, right? All of that's artifice, but there's something there that where the actor performs it in a way where, oh, we get it. And that's the craft of acting, right? And I think that something happens similarly with poems, except for like, I don't think we get paid as much.
Oh, thank you, Todd. And before we're going to wind up here because we've kept you for an hour, and you are busy poets and parents, and you've been very generous with your time. And I want to just ask one more question before we go, because I don't think we've ever had two readers who are both parents of twins and who are poets. And some people would say that it's impossible to be a poet when you live with when you're raising twins. And I wonder if you know, you have any thoughts on that, on how parenthood and especially sort of double parenthood at once has either changed or benefited, or how you juggle it for poets who think that maybe they don't have enough time in their lives and they just have a cat.
I would say to embrace the beauty of short form poetry. If you're someone who is daunted by parenthood and the lack of time, rediscover some forms that really limit your line length or syllable count. That worked for me in the early days of parenthood. The other thing that was important for me was to remind myself that, and I think this is Ada Limon's term too, that I was maybe not writing during those hours and nights, especially sleepless nights, but I was gathering. And I think I was gathering material, experience that would find its way onto the page one day. And just to be patient with your own process. There's no right timeline for writing a poem, for publishing a book. And that's been an important thing to remind myself of all the time.
I'm still figuring it out. Right now I have a 7-year-old and a pair of 2-year-olds. And so at night I'm not gathering, I'm just, surviving. I think for me, it's like just accepting that, there are times when I can't do it. I just can't write poems. Before I had kids, I was like, I can write poems anytime, right? Just show me a place where I can't write poems. Well, I'm there now. It's hard for me to get any work done. And so there are times where I just have to accept I'm not going to write poems right now. And there are times I just really have to accept the poem I'm writing is going to suck. It's going to be terrible and it's going nowhere. And that's fine, because it's testing what I've always said, that I always said that, a draft is disposable. You walk in and it's going to go. You're probably not going to use it. Right. And you have to sort of accept that. And so it's really been that's been tested for me. Just knowing that, the poems that I write, there will be fewer of them. They will probably be less successful because I'm exhausted and I just can't figure out how to fit, my full writing brain and heart into it because I'm busy with taking care of kids. So I think that, we just survive. We survive day to day and hope, right? There's that word, hope. We just hope that we can get a poem tomorrow, right? Because there's always tomorrow. I agree. There's no timeline on a book. There's no timeline on a career, because those things aren't as important as the poems, and those are separate, right? So poems, it's being a poet. It's doing the writing and not necessarily writing the book. Love to write the book, but I'll settle for the poems.
Well, thank you. Thank you both very much for being poets and for writing poems and for sharing them with all of us. And I also appreciate your generosity for coming on today for Alaska Quarterly Review. And so on behalf of the Center for Lyric and Narrative Arts and Alaska Quarterly Review and Ron Spatz, I thank you too, and I thank all of you who are here today. And I encourage you to support poets and writers in all kinds of ways. Of course, this is a fundraising series for Alaska Quarterly Review, so that's one. Giving someone a literary magazine for a subscription is another one. Buying books, and preferably at your local independent bookstore. If you say, well, my bookstore doesn't have poetry. Well, you go in and order one, and I'll bet you that they'll order two because they figured you liked it. So maybe they could sell the other one. And that's happened here in Haines. Now there's a pretty long shelf of poetry in our local bookstore, thanks to the AQR series, because when someone's coming on, I'd go and make sure I get their poems and have them. And so people have been reading more, and that's how it works. And I think the world needs poets now more than ever. So again, thank you very much for being here, and thanks to Cody Carver at the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center, and thanks to all of you. And we'll see you next time. We have one more left, one more recording and reading left in the series, and that will be coming up the final week of National Poetry Month. So thank you, and stay well, and I look forward to reading more of your works, both of you. So it's been wonderful.